Welcome to today's webinar on worker voices in public procurement, a cutting-edge topic for many public buyers. This is the sixth free webinar in a series on socially responsible public procurement intended primarily for public buyers. Let's see. Oops. As you will have noticed, all participants are on mute for the sake of sound quality, but we do encourage you to think about questions and comments during the presentations that you will hear. So if you can think of a question, then please send a chat message to Martina Hooper, whom you will see in the participant list, and she will then coordinate the Q&A at the end of the presentations, read your questions and comments afterwards. Please use a private chat to Martina directly rather than a chat to everyone for the questions. And if possible, also state who your question is for. And if you have any kind of technical questions or technical issues during the webinar, you can also raise those with Martina through the private chat function. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be available through the Electronics Watch website on the event section after the event. So before we get started, a brief word about Electronics Watch. Electronics Watch is an independent monitoring organization that helps public sector organizations work together to protect the rights of workers in their electronic supply chains. We do this work in collaboration with civil society monitoring partners and experts located in the regions where electronics is produced through worker-driven monitoring. There are more than 300 public sector organizations in 7 countries that share the cost of monitoring electronic supply chains and coordinate their engagement with industry through Electronics Watch to lower their cost and to maximize their impact. In collaboration with monitoring partners in 11 countries, we have seen direct improvements on conditions in factories employing many tens of thousands of workers on issues ranging from forced labor to wages and working hours. And today's topic is a vital one because there is no sustainable change in a workplace if workers are intimidated and silenced and if they don't have an effective, meaningful voice in their workplace. Electronics Watch addressed this topic in a recent policy brief called Worker Voices from Talk to Action. And in this brief, we make the following point briefly. First of all, that silencing of workers is in fact an industry-wide structural problem. It therefore resists easy solutions through social audits and also through new so-called worker voice mobile applications. As a first step, we recommend that good listening to workers means listening to workers on their terms. That is, when they have time, where they feel safe, because they see a benefit to talking, and often through a network of social relations that is built up over time. But for workers to have a meaningful voice means more than being heard in interviews. It also means that they have the time, space, resources, and security to engage in meaningful dialogue with employers and with buyers to improve workplaces and drive change. These are the key points in this brief that you can find on our website, electronicswatch.org. This webinar then is part of a series of webinars on socially responsible public procurement. Previous webinars have addressed supply chain transparency, responsible mining, the risk of employee suicides in the electronic sector in China, health and safety issues, and migrant worker recruitment. And it is not too early to mark your calendars for the 2019 Electronics Watch Annual Conference, which will take place on December 4th in Barcelona, where you can meet many of the webinar presenters throughout the year. And so now I have the great pleasure to introduce to you our presenters today. First up will be Gopinathan Parakuni with Civil Initiatives for Development and Peace, or CIVIDEP India. So Gopi is a founding member and has been General Secretary of CIVIDEP since its inception in the year 2000. He has worked in English daily journalism and with civil society organizations concerned with the rights of Dalits, women, marginal farmers, and informal sector workers. Gopi did his master's in social work with personnel management and labor welfare as specializations. And after Gopi's presentation, you will hear from Kathleen McCoy, who is Manager of Sustainable Supply Chains in the Stockholm region in Sweden. Kathleen has law degrees from both Canada and Sweden. She has worked for over 20 years with human rights and environmental issues for non-governmental organizations. She presently works with human rights, worker rights, and anti-corruption in public procurement for the region of Stockholm, including the region's electronic supply chains. So thank you very, very much to both of you for being with us today. And I believe that first we will hear from Gopi. So Gopi, if you are on the line with us, you can talk now. Martina, is Gopi with us?
Gopi, can we just do a sound check? Well, he's with us, but something's happening with his sound, so
okay.
Sort it out.
Then, Kathleen, if it's okay with you, we will switch to order, and if you want to do the presentation first, and then we will switch back to Gopi.
Sure.
Then I will stop. Yes, I will stop sharing, and you should start sharing your screen.
Yeah. Let's see here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great.
Just enlarge it. Perfect.
Good. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. My name is Kathleen and I work for the region of Stockholm. And just to put things in perspective, the region of Stockholm is bigger than the municipality. So it's about 26, I think, different municipalities in the entire region of Stockholm. And we're responsible for providing our citizens with healthcare, public transport. We also work with regional planning and culture. We've had a code of conduct in place since 2008. It's based on the United Nations Global Compact. So those 10 principles, which can be narrowed down to these 4 main topics, which are human rights, labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption. And this is also a code of conduct that all the regions in the entire country of Sweden share. So we all have the same code of conduct when it comes to our suppliers. Our process is probably similar to many public buyers' processes. We have the first step is doing a risk analysis of what it is we are about to procure. We have a dialogue with our suppliers because different sectors have come to different stages when it comes to sustainability, and especially in these issues. We deal a lot with suppliers that might have worked on environment, for example, but are rather new to the issue of human rights and labor rights. We have contractual terms. So in all of our contracts with our suppliers, we have legally binding terms. And we do some follow-up. And the issue with follow-up is a challenge because it's a resource issue. And I can say that on the environmental issues, we have the resources now to follow up maybe half of our contracts that are centrally procured. It's a bit easier with environment. You can ask for some kind of verification, some proof. But on social issues, there are more complex issues and it takes more digging, and there's no certification, there's no papers that they can just be sent. So it takes more time. When we discover deviations or non-compliances, we do have the option, if they're severe or if the supplier refuses to address these or to take corrective actions, we do have the option of terminating a contract. But that's really a last resort. We try to work with our suppliers to work for improvements instead. So if I come to the issue of the ICT sector now, this is just a list when we've done our risk analysis. But as you see, and as I'm sure we'll hear much more from Gopi very shortly, most of the issues have to do with worker rights. There are other issues as well, but very many have to do with workers' rights. And so our ambition has been to try to address this by trying to increase worker voice. In our contracts with our suppliers, we say that goods and services provided to us shall be produced under conditions which are compatible with, and then we list international standards and conventions, and then we list as well the ILO core conventions, 87 and 98. So the list is there, and as you all know, in the globalized world we live in, we cannot ask for guarantees that all of this will be respected, because that's not how we know. We know that what we're procuring is being produced, unfortunately, not in conformity with all of these. We also have a second challenge, which is many of our suppliers are not the brand owners. It's usually a reseller. So we have a challenge there, even legally, to what demands. What we have to do is place demands on our resellers and then ask them to put demands further down the supply chain. So what we're looking for, and what we also have written in our contracts, is that, and this is very much, it's in the pink box here on your screens, very much based on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We're looking for some kind of due diligence. Is there a policy? Are they forwarding our demands in the supply chain? Are they doing their own risk analysis? Are they monitoring compliance? And so on. If you look at the ILO and the core conventions, and when it comes to freedom of association, there's nothing very proactive about what it states. So this is what is in our contract, but basically what it says, it's all about the right to establish organizations and the right to be protected. So employers are not allowed to interfere. But the reality is that there are many countries where the law limits people's ability to freely join organizations. And that's an extra challenge. So the ILO doesn't really address this challenge. In our code of conduct, we've written that in countries where freedom of association is limited by law, the supplier will act so that employees can meet the employer to discuss wages and working conditions without negative consequences. So we're looking for some kind of facilitation of dialogue, some kind of empowerment. So that's in the code of conduct. It's not in the contract. The code of conduct, of course, is important, but it's not legally binding per se. So, very good to have certain things in the contract and the code of conduct, but even if we say that they should live up to certain standards, our suppliers, we don't know whether they've lived up to these standards until we do the follow-up. And then you can remember what I said a few minutes ago about us not having the resources to follow up more than maybe perhaps 12% of our contracts. So this is a challenge. They'll sign the contract, they'll say, sure, we do this, we follow this up in the supply chain, but you don't know whether they do until you follow up. So we've been exploring how we could use other tools during the procurement phase and a bit earlier perhaps to try to come to this issue and address this issue. And what I'll talk a little bit about is our experience that we've done in the past year with trying to use award criteria. So if you look here at the evaluation model, so basically for those who aren't familiar with public procurement, what award criteria do is that you set up a list of things that you would like to see, so they're not obligatory. And what you say to the suppliers or the companies that submit tenders that try to get a contract is you say, if you meet criteria A, B, or C, you'll get a bonus. So it can work in different ways, but basically what you're doing is that suppose you have two suppliers coming in with different prices, and the one that is offering a bid that's more expensive for the region of Stockholm, for example, you'd say, well, if you fulfill all of these sustainability criteria, we'll take off fictitiously an amount from the price that you've offered, so that company can end up winning the bid, even though they came in with a higher price, if they fulfill all of the sustainability criteria. So that's the thought behind award criteria. Once they've said they fulfill these criteria, they do become binding once they've signed the contract. So for the PC procurement, it was the first time that we did this. We proceeded then to 7 more hardware procurements during the year. We said we'll put 70% on price, 30% on quality, and what we define as quality is half on environmental criteria and half on social. And so our award criteria for this specific issue of worker voice went something like this. So in countries where freedom of association is limited by law, we want to see brand owners that are taking proactive measures to facilitate dialogue was basically the content. So what we were looking for is some kind of structures, worker committees, or organizations where the worker representatives are chosen by workers, and that there's some kind of regular dialogue with management and on things like working conditions, including salary. So if I go here, the verification, because we have to list how they can fulfill this. We said that we were looking for documentation, description. It could be a third party's certified audit protocol showing these things. How are the workers organized? How is the dialogue taking place? And what proactive measures have been taken? I can say that of the 8 tenders that we've done, the majority of the suppliers just answered no to this question. Straight off, we do not live up to this, or the brand owners don't live up to this criteria. One did try by submitting a paper showing that they were using the RBA, which is the Responsible Business, I don't remember right now if it's alliance or association, but their method of auditing, basically. But if you look at the RBA VAP, there's nothing proactive about it. It's very much along the lines of the ILO. It is about the right to enroll, or that there's no evidence of management interference. But as I said, we were looking for something proactive. So we did not accept this as verification. And there was one tender where we granted them an award point on this. And their description was basically from the sustainability report, and we found that in that description they met all the criteria. They described how the workers were being organized and what kind of dialogue they were having. This is a bit of a complicated picture, but I said that this is not the only award criteria, but we've been using the award criteria even in transparency, for example. Transparency both on final assembly or on components, where we've been saying, where is the factory? What's your risk assessment? How high risk is this factory? And we've also been asking for a chemical inventory, and then we've been asking for evidence of this worker voice or empowerment, or their ability to influence. And for every procurement in general, we've been seeing a movement. So what we'll see is that for transparency, there's been some reluctance at the beginning, but we're getting, for every award, when the suppliers are realizing that this is worth money and they might be able to win a contract if they live up to this, they've been basically more and more likely to fill in our questionnaires and to meet our requirement, but not on this issue, which I find interesting. The chemical inventory has also been a challenge, but when it comes to transparency, and we've had other issues as well, there's been more of a movement. So to just some conclusions and next thoughts, and hopefully to provoke some questions. The challenges in general after our experience of using these criteria has been verification, of course, because, and this is a challenge always when you're doing public procurement, is that you ask for some kind of paperwork, some descriptions, but you can never know what things look like on the ground. And this is the case even for this, even the one tender where we decided to give them a point for this particular criteria, it was based on their own description. And it's only when we monitor that we can know whether this is the truth or not. And I have to, after having a few dialogues with some suppliers and brand owners, reflected over whether the industry wants to increase workers' voices. I mean, yeah, I'll leave it at that, but I'm questioning it. So the next steps for us is we're having, since we've had all of these in 1 year, very many hardware procurements, we're having a dialogue actually next week with both resellers and some brands to discuss this one, but also other challenges and how we can learn from the experience we've made this year and start thinking about how to monitor and how to do the next round. Of course, dialogue with Electronics Watch and monitoring partners. And I've been also thinking about other ways to address, if award criteria might not be the right tool for this particular issue, could there be other things that you put in the contract instead that they're obliged to fulfill during the period of the contract? So could you say, instead of saying up front when they're leaving their tenders, is this something that the brand owners do, yes or no? You can say the company or the supplier that signs a contract with us will need to live up to this within 1 year of signing the contract, and then you'd have to monitor it. So this is just some thoughts I've had since the award criteria. We've used it several times, but I'm wondering whether maybe it's the wrong tool or if there's other ways. And then finally, I just wrote living wage because, I mean, the reason we want to increase worker voice is because we believe that when workers increase their power towards the management and towards their employers, then many of these issues will be resolved. But if maybe we have to start addressing the separate issues and the separate risks separately. So living wage, for example, doing that parallel, how do we start working with that in our supply chains? It's in our code of conduct, but we don't have it in our contracts, and what would be the next step? So addressing the risks separately, in addition to trying to address this question as well during the procurements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. This is a fascinating endeavor that you have embarked upon here with award conditions for worker voice, and I'm sure they're going to be questions and discussions, but I am told that Gopi has sound, and so we're going to try to turn it over to Gopi right now.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. Thank you, Gopi.
All right. So I'm Gopinath Parakuni, and CVDEP, for whom I work, has some 20 years experience in working with garment workers in the electronic sector, in leather, plantation, and some other light engineering sectors. So what I am presenting is from this experience in directly working with a large, diverse workforce, and almost all of them are part of global supply chains. So what I will look at in this 10 or 15 minutes is the central question that Electronics Watch itself has posed in its policy paper. Why are workers in the modern supply chain silent and pliable? So I will say a few things about, what's our experience, why are they silent, why are they pliable? I'll say a few things about that. And secondly, how do we, as, in whatever role, as supervisors, managers, buyers, procurers, how do we listen to workers, and after that, the third kind of element in my presentation is how do we move towards social dialogue? So why are workers silent? Secondly, how do we listen to workers? And thirdly, what are some ways in which to move towards more meaningful social dialogue? So when we talk about workers, why are workers not able to bring up their complaints or, or engage in any kind of conversation with management. First of all, we must note that most of the workers are first generation industrial workers. They're very unsure and they're very fearful of the factory atmosphere and of supervisors and managers. So this prevents them from, saying anything at all. Sometimes the silence is deafening, on the shop floor, except for the sewing or whatever operations are going on. You must see also that there are closed circuit TVs, the workers are watched. So the workers are really fearful and unsure of themselves, on the factory floor. Secondly, many workers are women. You can find more workers in this supply chain, more women in this supply chain than men. And supervisors and managers are largely men. So the gender domination, the gender subordination plays it out on the shop floor also. And the relationships, in a rural society, the gender relationship in the rural society from which they come is carried over to the factory workflow. Thirdly, factory managers, as one can imagine, are more educated than the workforce, surely, and they use the power of knowledge to manipulate. They will say, managers will say they are managing workers, but we see a lot of manipulation of the workforce. And also, workers are not aware of their basic rights in the workplace, which is provided by national law or international standards. So workers are hardly aware of their fundamental workers' rights. Fourthly, workers are anxious about the stability of their employment. Being silent is one way to improve their chances of being being retained. So any open articulation of dissent brings about very rapid reaction from the management. They are blacklisted sometimes. They can't even find employment in other factories in the area. So this is one big issue, that the workers are, the management is hostile towards any kind of dissenting voices from the workers. Fifthly, of course, workers do not have organizations that can represent their voice, represent their views and needs. Trade unions are a rarity in the supply chain. So this is a kind of a profile, characteristics of the workforce, and these lead to the kind of silence and pliability of the workforce. Secondly, how do we listen to workers? How can managers, and those who are interested in listen to workers? One of the ways that supervisors and managers need training in listening, non-judgmentally, without just looking for complaints. Listening has to go beyond complaints. It must be a genuine engagement. So supervisors and managers definitely need training in listening to workers non-judgmentally. Secondly, listening and responding need to need to be included in the skill set that's required of managers and supervisors. In recruiting managers, in recruiting supervisors, listening skills, ability to respond to workers, must be a criteria. And how you do it is a different matter. But employers must look in managers the quality, the skill, the attitude, to engage workers, talk to workers, listen to workers. And this should reflect, practically, this should reflect in their evaluation, assessment, or appraisal, whatever we call it. Another way to listen to workers on the shop floor is frequent, planned, open house meetings with the workers, where senior management participates. This can build confidence among workers, and they will be convinced, that the management is interested in them. But this shouldn't remain a kind of a complaint-speaking forum. It should be more to understand the workers and to build the confidence of the workers. But you can bet that in these open house meetings, which some companies do, workers will not voice their complaints. but this can help in building the confidence of workers. Thirdly, senior management should be encouraged. Management should be encouraged to meet the community off-site, meet the workers in their communities. In their communities, the workers are more confident. Our experience is that workers speak with less fear, with more confidence, because they are where their people are, their families and community are. So off-site, even in audits, off-site audits are a very good instrument to understand, what the workers' feelings are. So managers need to be encouraged, to have as practical as possible, meetings in the community of workers. Fourthly, opinion leaders need to be identified. Opinion leaders among the workforce. Workers' committees is a good way to do this. But our experience is that many of these committees do not function. So in our kind of evaluation, or one of the indicators must be how active is the works committee. Do they meet regularly? Is it the same minutes all the time? Are there different diverse issues which are discussed? So the works committee minutes, recording the minutes and going through those minutes and looking for if it's a robust discussion, so will be quite helpful. So these are some ways in which one can listen to workers and workers' needs. Thirdly, how do we move towards more meaningful social dialogue? I would expand the meaning of social dialogue to include the sections of society from which the workers originate. One shouldn't narrow it down to just talking that workforce in the factory. They come from a certain social background. They come from a certain socio-economic background. So it's very important for management to understand the characteristics of the socio-economic characteristics of the workforce. So yeah, and what are these characteristics? These are typical globally. Most of these workers in the supply chain are assetless. They have hardly any assets, and that's why they are wage laborers. Secondly, their educational achievements are low. Otherwise they wouldn't be in the factory. Usually they have strong family and community loyalties. So managers sometimes say that no workers are away. During the weekend, they don't come back on Monday. So we must understand that these workers, for them, their relationship with their family and their community is very important. Sorry about the interruption. Yeah. So you have to see that these workers' loyalty with the families and community is strong, and they are first generation industrial workers. I've already mentioned that their values and attitudes, they bring the values and attitudes of a rural and agrarian culture. Yeah. 1 minute. Just hold on. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm in a cafe and I had to request people to, people to be quieter. This another way to move towards social dialogue is, as I said earlier, functioning stable workers' committees. Some things will help, in making sure that workers' committees are functional and stable. We have to look for low turnover of members and leaders in the committee. Anybody who is auditing must see that how big is the turnover of the members and leaders in this committee. What are the kind of issues that are discussed in these committees? Are there recommendations and suggestions made by these committees which are useful for the management? So if the management takes the workers' committee seriously, then the workers have some kind of, the credibility of the committees is higher among workers. The workers' committee's recommendations have to be accepted, of course, whichever are practical. So if the workers see that the workers' committees are functional and their interventions are useful, then the credibility of the workers' committees are higher. for social dialogue, it's not enough, that management talk to the workforce. They have to engage with trade unions and labor support CSOs in the area. I mean, even if the workers in the factory are not members of the CSOs of the trade unions, it will be useful if there is some linkages, some engagement with the trade unions in the region. Fourthly, it's very useful to talk to academics or institutions in the area who have an interest in industrial relations and labor welfare in that region. I mean, in most regions, you can see that there are research institutions, or social science institutions, which has done studies about the workforce there, and interaction with academicians is a very good way to understand the workforce better. And of course, the big step is actually recognizing a trade union in the factory or in the group of factories. We are a long way from achieving that, but that ought to be the long-term goal, that workers can be engaged through their representative organizations. Social dialogue is, of course, an ongoing process, and a robust social dialogue policy must be in place with the clear indicators for performance. So, this is what I wish to say. And I would be very happy to answer questions. And I hope you could hear most of what I said. Thank you very much.
Yes, Gopi, you came in clear, and thank you so very much for this very informative presentation. I think that perhaps after your presentation, it is clear why Kathleen talked about what she talked about the importance of addressing worker voice in the public procurement process. So thank you both. And I think at this point we have some time for questions and answers. So I'm going to turn it over to Martina, who will be able to read some of the questions that have come in. And while she does that, I'm sure if you have other thoughts or the questions, keep on sending them by chat to Martina, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can, and otherwise follow up later via email.
Okay, so I'll start with Gopi while he's got good sound. So the first question for you, Gopi, do flexible employment practices have an impact on worker voice? Do you see a difference between permanent workers and contract workers in this respect?
Yeah, definitely. Flexible practices means a huge turnover of the workforce. And human relationship, as you know, doesn't develop overnight. So unless there are leaders, workers who have been in the factory for a longer while, there isn't a culture to talk about. I mean, each workplace traditionally has had a culture. So one can see that in some of these factories there is very high turnover. Most workers would have worked. It will depend upon change from factory to factory. So if there is a huge turnover of workers, a small core number of permanent workers, a large number of contract workers, that disrupts the production, that disrupts the relationship. So the more, of course, 100% stability is never possible, but the more long-term workers you have, the easier it is, the more productive it will be to engage with them, and which will definitely have impact on productivity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
in most cases we see that, as I said, the turnover is very high in many of these factories, most of these factories.
Okay, and another question. Could you please give some real-life examples of the issues you described?
Martina, I couldn't hear you.
Could you give perhaps a real-life example, a case of the issues described? Real-life examples, we have seen factories where the wages are really not very higher than the market price, but rate, but we have seen workers staying for 15 years or more. And what we have found that it's basically because the management is, less oppressive or more friendly. They understand the workforce, they understand their needs, and though practically the wages are not very different, we have seen that when there is conversation between the workforce and the management, the workers tend to stay longer. Even foregoing possible increment in wages in another factory. I would say that workers want stability and peace of mind, kind of being wanted, being liked in their factories, much more than anything else. Of course, wages is very important, but if there is a certain sense of belonging to the factory, to the company, and the management values them, it might look very romantic, but we have practically seen that the workers' loyalty to the company, to the factory, is much stronger, when the management is, management takes care, to talk to them, to understand them. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Now I'm going to move over to Kathleen for a couple of questions. When did Stockholm region start to apply the sustainable contractual obligations?
Oh, that's a good question. Before my time, so I've been working for a year and a half, the actual contractual obligations have been there. I can't say exactly, actually, because it was a few years before, but I know that using award criteria is new. So from what I gather, the PC procurement was the first time they were used, and I can say that they were used for all of them, all the IT procurement, but we've also started to use award criteria in other high-risk areas. So we're doing instruments right now, surgical instruments, where we've also had award criteria about transparency in the supply chain. Yeah, hopefully we can expand and use them in other high-risk areas. So contractual obligations have been there for a couple of years. Unsure, actually, sorry about that. And then trying to use other tools like award criteria or even qualification, which is even a step earlier, where we look for some kind of processes, some kind of policies in place to even qualify to leave, to hand in a bid, a tender. That's also new for about a year and a half ago.
Okay, and another question to you and to all of us is how we could overcome barriers to cooperating a bit more strategically and collaboratively on engaging with companies. For example, sharing planned pipeline of procurement or coordinating contractor award criteria or supplier engagements, etc.
Could you read that one more time,
sure,
slowly?
Yeah.
It was a lot.
So how we could overcome barriers to cooperating a bit more strategically and collaboratively engaging with companies. So that's the question. And for example, sharing planned pipeline of procurement or coordinating contractor award criteria or supplier engagement, etc.
I mean, my first thoughts when I hear you ask the question is there's two things. I think we're at a disadvantage when it comes to, when you're in public procurement, you're at a disadvantage when it comes to information. And that's why I find the electronics watch and monitoring partners so crucial, because it's so easy for our suppliers and their sub-suppliers to say to us, everything is fine. We have the paperwork, we have the routines in place. And it's only when we can come with a report or with, that we've heard firsthand from a monitoring partner that is not the case, that we have the information upper hand. That we say we know because we have other sources that tell us that things are not the way you describe them. That's, of course, to complete, I mean, we should be doing our own monitoring, and we have to look into that as well, but also to be able to gather information from other sources. So that, I think, is just something that needs to increase even more, so that we know what's going on the ground, so we can counter any arguments that everything is fine. That's one thing. And then public procurers, yes, increase the across, well, I was about to say Europe, but there's no boundaries for that, because it's only, I was about to say the power of dollars and signs, but pennies, but we're region of Stockholm, we find that we're, a fairly large actor, but that's because we're comparing ourselves with the rest of the Nordic countries. But of course, if several public buyers were putting the same kind of demands and the same kinds of pressures, I think, of course, we could achieve more by putting more pressure. How to do that practically is difficult, because I know I myself have been promising a toolkit for about a year now, and I just haven't gotten around to doing it. Still on my to-do list. But yeah, we need to be sharing more of the tools and the experiences. Of course, these kinds of webinars are also useful. And the conference is a way of sharing information.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit too. This is Björn with Electronics Watch, and it's a great question. And of course, I think that the Kathleen in the Stockholm region has impact, and drives transparency in proportion to how much they are actually coordinated within the country. All the 21 county councils within Sweden are working together on these issues, sharing a common code, as Kathleen mentioned. And similarly, I think with Electronics Watch, there are several factory cases where conditions have improved, and at least a couple of those are public on our website. The Foxconn case in Czech Republic, the Calcon case in Thailand, many other cases as well. They're not yet public, but the conditions improve there simply because the companies do know that we represent a number of public sector buyers, affiliates to Electronics Watch, who are concerned about what is happening in those factories, are concerned if we report that there are labor rights or health and safety violations. And so this coordination and communication with companies in a coordinated way is happening and is having an impact, and needs, as Kathleen indicated, to go much deeper and further. But it is already having an impact. I think we also see this impact on the level of supply chain transparency. If you go back to remember some of the slides that Kathleen showed about transparency of first tier and even second tier, we have seen companies responding to the demands of public sector buyers, not just in Sweden, but also in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Switzerland, and elsewhere. And they also, of course, have there are also demands from other stakeholders for them to become more transparent. But this is definitely having an impact. And in terms of coordinating, how we phrase demands in public procurement, I think it's really good for public buyers and affiliates to public buyers to have a dialogue around, can we use selection criteria, as Kathleen just mentioned? What award criteria are useful and impactful? And Electronics Watch, of course, has focused on contract conditions, those conditions that apply after a contract is signed, is awarded and signed. And our model contract clauses that we make available for affiliates to use if they wish is available now on our website, and it's version 2.1. So that version, it has already been informed by the experience, not just of affiliates, but also the experience of suppliers. So it's a really good question, and and coordination, collaboration is absolutely the way in which we make progress. And to drive this further is very much at the core of what Electronics Watch seeks to accomplish.
Right, we have a little bit more time for some more questions. So another one for Kathleen. Let's see. I don't think I've asked this yet. Where did the impulse to apply the obligations come from? Was it EU directives and then the local law was formed, or was it from the grassroots, NGOs or activists?
It was media. No, I mean, we've had, again, this is the history that I've heard since I've only been there for over a year, but there was a sustainability department. So I think, as usual, there was a mandate, but of course, very driven individuals that started working with these issues, and the national coordination, of course, helped. I mean, the fact that we're sharing the same code of conduct. So that, as you see, that's over 10 years ago that's been in process. But the increase in resources, the increase in attention, the fact that we can start exploring different tools within the procurement process has a lot to do with a few scandals in the media. So in 2015, especially when it comes to IT, there was a story, or like an investigative journalist, and a report written, and basically the link was made between taxpayers' money and bad working conditions in Asia, and computers purchased by the region. And although there was a little sustainability team with maybe one person doing this, part-time and following up our resellers and our contracts, as soon as this was in the media and politicians got microphones under their chins with critical questions from journalists saying, how can we be using taxpayers' money and contributing to bad working conditions in other countries, the resources increased. So I almost get happy every time there's a bit of a scandal in the media, because I'm thinking, good, this is coming to politicians' attention. It was at that point, I think, as well, that the politicians in the region said that they wanted the region of Stockholm to be the best public buyer in terms of sustainability in all of Europe. So the ambition was set at it, because we're politically driven as being a public buyer. So it was partly that. I think it's the combination of very driven individuals working at the department, and on top of that having a political mandate. The law, of course, facilitates all of this, because the EU directive that was then transposed into national law makes putting demands not only on sustainability criteria not only possible, but I think this is in the directive. It's definitely in the Swedish law. It says that when there's a risk of the ILO core conventions being breached, we shall, not we ought to, but we shall make contractual demands on our suppliers. So the EU directive definitely knocked over the last, reluctant people. And sometimes, half of the legal department is all for us and half of the legal department is not. But so that also had a role to play.
Okay, thanks. And Gopi, I've got another question for you. And again, it goes out to all of us. There's a lot of issues for workers, flexible working, etc. Do we already have, or do you think it would help to have a prioritized list by region or industry of top issues we can address? For example, blacklisting, risk, chemicals. Yeah, that's it.
Special issues, but there are also cross-cutting issues. For example, hostility towards workers' organizations is all over. So I think, in our experience, it's very important to see that workers are allowed to come together, whatever its form, whether in in-house committees, or trade unions. I think there are some important issues which is non-negotiable, though it figures very high on social audit or kind of codes of conduct. In practice, there is hardly any attention. So surely a prioritization helps. Wages is a problem in many places, but there are some special issues. For example, sexual harassment might be much more severe in certain areas, depending upon the surrounding culture. So definitely, the prioritizing will help. Yeah, and that's also the point of social dialogue. To understand what are the most significant issues in that region, and how can they be addressed. Yeah.
Okay, and I think we've just got time for one more question. And go back to you, Kathleen. Okay, in those countries where worker rights are not guaranteed, how can suppliers ensure that workers have dialogue with employers without entering into conflict with the governments of those countries?
I'm not an expert on local legislation when it comes to countries like China, but what I understand is that there's one union. So there is no freedom of association because you can't form your own and you can't join anything else but the one union that there is. But what I've understood is that there's other ways to have a dialogue in the working place that wouldn't necessarily break the law. I mean, what I understand is, again, please anyone correct me if I'm wrong, the law just says that there is this one union and that no other unions will be recognized. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a dialogue or a group of people representing worker interests. So from my understanding, it's possible to have a dialogue, without calling it a union or it doesn't have to have that form. But what you're trying to do is increase the voice and increase a channel for the workers' concerns or interests when it comes to issues of wages or other working conditions to be heard by the management. So anyone's welcome to correct me as I'm wrong, but what I've understood is that wouldn't be breaking the local law.
Okay, thank you. And that's it. Over to you, Bjorn.
Okay, then if there's a China expert online right now, feel free to respond to Kathleen's last comment online over email. If you're not in touch with her directly, send it to either Martina or myself, and we'll link you up with Kathleen. But indeed, Electronics Watch, when we have the opportunity to do so, we do seek to conduct worker management dialogue trainings in Chinese factories as well as one of the processes to build durable solutions in those factories. So I want to thank Gopi and Kathleen so much for your thoughtful presentations. And what strikes me right now, I'd like to put your two heads together because it seems that Gopi has a lot of practical experience on what it means, why workers don't have a voice in the workplace, particularly in India, but a lot of his experiences in India are applicable to elsewhere, and also practical suggestions as to steps forward, and perhaps some of those suggestions can be now translated into contract award criteria. So I think that this webinar has pointed to the need not just for public buyers to coordinate and collaborate, but also for the labor rights experts in production regions such as CVDEP and the public buyers such as the region Stockholm to collaborate. So again, a big thanks to Gopi and Kathleen, and to sorry, I'm supposed to advance the slide here, and to all the participants for joining. This webinar series is part of the Make ICT Fair project, which is funded by the European Union. And like other webinars, a recording of this webinar will be available shortly on the Electronics Watch website. So thank you again, and remember to mark your calendars for the 4th of December for our annual conference in Barcelona. Thank you very much, everybody.